Okay, we're just going to give it another couple of minutes. We're just waiting for one of the presenters to join, and then we will kick off our WA Medical Datathon webinar. So bear with us for 2 minutes, and then we'll get right into it. Thanks. Okay, we are going to get started. We're just having a couple of technical difficulties with the last speaker, but that's okay. Hopefully Martin will be able to join us there at the end. So thank you everyone online for joining us for an introduction to the WA Medical Datathon webinar. So the point of this webinar is really to give everyone sort of initially a flavour of what the webinar, what the Datathon is all about. And just what's happening in the healthcare sector around data science, data analytics, and data-driven insights. And we've got some fantastic speakers for you today who I will introduce shortly. So really, I guess, why are we running this datathon? It's quite similar to one that was run in Queensland in May. But really, we want to showcase the power of data and analytics within the healthcare sector. And look at all the amazing possibilities that data analytics can bring to that sector. We hopefully will solve some of the WA healthcare sector's biggest challenges through the use of data sets being brought into the datathon. And obviously, ultimately, it is to have fun. So the Datathon will run over 2 weekends. We have the option for teams to either participate in the Datathon face-to-face, or we will have virtual teams set up as well. So if it's not logistically feasible for you to participate in the Datathon face-to-face, you can definitely do it as virtual teams. And we will have Slack channels set up. We will have technical people as well as subject matter experts available over those weekends as well. We will kick off the Datathon at a sort of launch event on the 7th of November at Telethon Kids Institute, where we'll provide teams with all the information that they need to get cracking on the Datathon. We have some awesome challenges that have come directly from the WA healthcare sector, and each team will have a challenge owner who will sort of be intimately involved with that challenge and be able to sort of help teams navigate what viable solutions will look like to solve those challenges. Teams can either come sort of pre-formed, or we're happy to set teams up as well. So we're looking at teams of around sort of 5 to 8 participants ideally. There will be Telethon Kids has a room available over both weekends from 11 to 2 each day of the weekends, and we will have people available during those times who can help sort of navigate your teams. We'll have specialist Amazon Web Services technical people to help you navigate their platform as well. We'll bring data sets to the teams as well that they can use. So these will either be closed data sets coming from the healthcare sector in WA, or open source data sets that you can use to solve the challenges ahead of you. The Datathon will culminate in a pitch event where each of the teams will pitch their ideas, their solutions, their concepts to the judges as well. And we have some great prizes provided by AWS. The winning teams will, if they want to actually continue to develop their idea and their concept, they will get support from the WA Data Science Innovation Hub as well as AWS to continue to progress their idea through to hopefully an actual solution that we can embed within the healthcare sector. Happy to answer any more questions sort of towards the webinar around the Datathon, but do check out the web page that is on the WA Data Science Innovation Hub website. The specific Medical Datathon web page will continue to put lots of information up there and social media posts and the like. So just in terms of the key dates, so you can see the weekends there that the Datathon will be run, and where we'll have face-to-face sessions available. But like I said, if face-to-face is too hard logistically, don't let that put you off. We're happy for teams to sort of meet virtually as well. So I am going to get straight into this webinar. Like I said, we have some fantastic speakers for you today that have amazing international experience and an intimate understanding of how data is being used in the healthcare sector. So really great to have all these speakers on board today. So if I just move to the first speaker is Dr. Carlo Bellini. Carlo is a medical doctor turned business strategist, executive coach and speaker, and you can see Carlo's bio up there. Carlo has a huge passion for helping the healthcare sector innovate. He's got some fantastic experience coming out of Silicon Valley in AI, as well as innovating within the healthcare sector here in Western Australia. So I will hand over to Carlo, who will be giving us a talk on trends in healthcare. Hello, thank you.
Thanks so much, Liz, and a very big warm welcome to all of you here. As Liz said, my name's Carlo Bellini. By profession, I'm a medical doctor, and I worked clinically for a few years. I did my training in Western Australia and then went international, broadened out, and I've worked in healthcare business, strategy, and innovation. And most recently, I was based in Silicon Valley, where I was working in an artificial intelligence startup. So I think where I want to start, and for my summary, I'm going to give an overview of what I've seen in the evolution of healthcare really over the last years and where we are trending globally. And I'm going to do this in the framework, which is the 4 Ps, which many of you may have heard about in healthcare. The first P relates to personalization. of healthcare. The second one is prediction. The third is prevention, and the fourth is participation. And we're seeing significant trends occur in all of these areas. So let's first start with personalisation. If we look historically at the way that medical treatments and epidemiology has been done, we run randomized control trials, which are known as the best form of study. We take a particular treatment or an intervention and we compare it in a cohort of people to a particular control or the best standard of treatment available. What often is unknown is that the cohort of people that we actually experiment with those drugs on can often look demographically very similar, often Caucasian, male, of particular similar ages, and we lose the importance of understanding the diversity of impact that that treatment or intervention might actually have. For example, is it relevant to say that the same treatment will work with the same effectiveness on a United States middle-aged white man as it would from a person of Asian descent or African descent of a vastly different age and other different healthcare properties? So we come to this idea that one treatment might actually not fit all, and hence the notion of personalization and the growth of personalization. And what has enabled that is data, because the data has really inputted into our ability to start doing more sophisticated analyses, to be able to experiment more widely and collect different information that previously lived in a very fragmented, very unstructured world. Now, in the United States, we often think of the United States as, perhaps compared to Australia in some ways, as the leader or the center of innovation. And my personal experience is that some parts of the United States indeed are that, but some parts really, really run on legacy. And what I saw in healthcare in the US, as well as what I see in healthcare in Australia, is that we have a lot of data that exists, but it exists in an incredibly unstructured, fragmented way. In Australia, there's no universal health record. The government tried to do it really and failed in implementation. You've got data sitting with your GP, with your pathology provider, the hospital in Western Australia, everything's still on paper notes. It's really quite difficult, and we see that around the world. And as we increase our adoption of electronic health records, as we increase the amount of data that's actually organized and structured, when you go into hospital or healthcare clinic for treatment, we actually might be able to get more sophisticated analyses on what is the personalized treatment for you. And I think that's a really, really exciting area of healthcare. The next part is prediction. And when we look at prediction, it's a massive known area within data science that we're now able to predict with greater confidence. Then we can go, well, in healthcare, what do we actually want to predict? We want to predict who's going to get sick. Currently, we think of things in terms of risk. So there's certain set scores. For example, a very well-known one is in cardiovascular disease, the Framingham score. We take your age, your blood pressure, your cholesterol, smoking status, a variety of other factors, and we give you a 10-year risk of getting coronary artery disease. But we don't know if it's going to be you. Are you going to be one of the 11% that actually get it, or are you going to be one of the 89% that don't? So prediction is really, really important. Data is enabling that in a way that we've never been able to do it. Now, it's not just your health data that might actually input into prediction. It's a lot of information about you and your life. A really interesting one that I find is actually looking at financial data. And if we look at how you spend your money, the supermarkets you go to, the type of foods that you buy, do you buy cigarettes or not, there's actually so much data that's holding your financial fingerprint that is very much revealing of your health status. And we're now seeing disparate data sets that are getting interconnected. And we're able to get information both from social media as well, in terms of prediction around mental health, depression, anxiety. And some companies, you would have seen in the social dilemma, use this very much to their advantage, and other companies use this for prediction in terms of how can we actually support you. And I think that's a really significant space to grow. I'm going to share a video of you now of the CEO of Google, who talks about Google's artificial intelligence when it was seeking to predict admissions in hospital, and once people would get discharged, what is the likelihood of readmission? I'm going to share that now.
Carla. I'm not sure that's working.
Well, thank you very much for letting me know, Liz. That's good. If it's not working, I'll share just in brief, in summary of what it is. It's essentially Google took hospital admissions and they sought to make people's identify what is the likelihood they're going to get readmitted after getting discharged. And the thing that was really, really interesting is that they actually took hundreds of thousands of data points during someone's admission. So within an electronic medical record, there are so many touch points that you get that you're actually using to measure and monitor. And they essentially, with an accuracy of about 76%, could predict readmissions. And when we think about that, there is so much data that sits just under the human perception that I can't actually tell what's going on. I'm biased in a certain way with my experience. And as doctors, clinicians, nurses, whatever role you have in this area, you bring your own experience to it, which is essentially data sensing. But there is so much that goes on that's linked that an AI, an algorithm can do that we can't do as humans. So that's the overall notion there. The third one is prevention. So it's really, really interesting when we look at COVID and what happened with coronavirus. The first reports of coronavirus that were made from outside of China came from a group of researchers that actually analyze news and analyze words with AI, where they're looking for words with repeated areas about pneumonia, respiratory infection line. And it was a Canadian team that actually first flagged internationally that there could be an outbreak going on in Wuhan, in China. So we see that in that example, quite a really interesting example of data usage. Artificial intelligence was actually scanning news and seeking to read it to try and gather predictive and preventative health information. We're seeing that both from a personalized perspective, and this is where those previous areas of personalization and predictive analytics combine. So how can we actually prevent future illness with you? It might be quite different based on your genetics, based on your phenotype than on other people, but we need large amounts of data to actually do that analysis. And similarly, we're also seeing this in other areas of not just traditional healthcare, but also socio-cultural influences and the intersection of healthcare and how that actually affects your health outcomes and health determinants. And finally, participation. In a world that's more connected than ever, social media, people have their own online footprint, we're able to participate in our healthcare in a way that we never had before. We're able to go to Dr. Google, find out information that's there, some of it correct, some of it not correct. We're able to propagate misinformation as much as we're able to access the information that you would never have been able to 30 years ago that's relevant for your disease. The part that I think is particularly interesting there is the community and the connection that we can make for particularly rare or much less common conditions. If you look in Australia, our population is relatively small. In Perth, 2.5 million, Australia, 20 million, compare that to the United States, 350 million, China, 1 billion. We're actually relatively small. So if you actually have a particular condition that's rare, there's not many people around you, potentially. You're able now to connect to a much larger world and get access to information and connect with experts, and also the rise of citizen science and personalized science and the like. It all comes from access to data and access to information. So those are 4 areas that I see overall: increase in personalization, predictive analytics, prevention, and participation in healthcare. And I think it's a wonderful initiative that we're doing here in the Datathon. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Carlo. That was very inspiring. And what I liked about that is maybe, you know, people that are going to join the Datathon to start thinking about you know, other data sets they could potentially bring in. You know, it might not just be health data sets. You know, what else, what other data sets can add value to that challenge as well. So I think that's really fascinating. I'll just say quickly to everyone listening in, please, if you've got any questions, please feel free to go into the Q&A chat, and I will, at the end of everyone's talks, I will right at the end, I will answer those questions. So if you've got a question for a particular speaker, then if you can just say who that speaker is, and we'll get to those at the end. But without further ado, I will introduce our next speaker. So Dr. Rad Aniba is from Telethon Kids Institute. He's the head of strategy and governance at the institute. Rad completed a PhD at the University of Strasbourg in France, and he is an extremely experienced data professional and has joined us, maybe not so recently anymore, Rad, but from the United States. So he's got an amazing kind of global perspective of healthcare and research data challenges and looking at from governance and analytics. So Rad, I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really happy to be part of this panel, especially during these times that we are living in the COVID area. So I'm trying to share some thoughts with you about the challenges that we have from healthcare and from biomedical research perspective. I'm just gonna switch my screen here. So today I'm gonna give you a really high level description of the challenges that we are facing on the healthcare and biomedical research, especially from that data management perspective. And it's very aligned with what Carlo described earlier so nicely. So I'm just going to try to confirm and to cover another aspect of it from governance and how we use the analytics to find solutions to these problems. So I would start with the data maturity model. Again, this is aligning with what Carlo covered earlier. So all the organizations around the world, they are trying to navigate through this ladder of data maturity, trying to invest in technology and strategy to leverage the data as an asset to move that needle from stage to stage, trying to reach the ultimum sort of a point where everything is controlled and falling under the prescriptive, proactive, rather than being reactive and trying to react on changes and challenges that we are experiencing as we go forward. And really, in the world, like few organizations, they are falling into this optimized sort of stage where the data is used as an asset, and the rest of the organizations, they are trying to catch up, and this is where the challenges are sort of put on surface and to the rest of the world, because that transition is not easy. There's a lot of constraints and challenging trying to move an entire organization from one step to the other. So for the healthcare sector is not an exception. So this is the data maturity model that is a sort of international and covering in the different industries. But in the healthcare in particular there, I would describe the situation from two angles. So on the right side here, what you see on the screen is the ideal world where we want to go with this data and analytics in healthcare. We want to achieve all the previously described topics, from prevention of the diseases, trying to understand what's going on, and this is where all the researchers are studying different sort of diseases from different angles, leveraging the technologies and the multi-omics sort of studies where they look at the disease from different angles and trying to generate the insights and the knowledge out of the data. But also there's a lot of investment, and what I'm covering here is really a tiny piece of all the benefits that we can have in healthcare. I cannot put everything in a slide, but what comes often is like the leverage of the technologies for more advanced patient care and treatment, from cell imaging to usage of AI to predict cancer from cell imaging and helping people to do the right diagnosis about a specific disease in particular. Personalized diagnosis and genomics, this is what Carlo mentioned before in his discussion as well. But also there's the operational side of it from hospital management perspective, and the leverage of the data and do the integration towards providing a better service and to the patients. Now, to the left side of this figure, there's the reality of things. There's the data sitting in so many fragmented places and sources, and most of them are legacy systems that are very hard to connect to a more general and connected systems, just to try to make that data travel from one place to the other as seamless as possible. That's not something that is trivial in the healthcare sector to do. But also there's a lack of master data management, and most of the times, like, the data is falling into inconsistent situation where you can hardly track and make sure that you have the quality needed and requested for doing and generating insights out of the data without really worrying about whether or not you have a problem with the data integrity. So there's these two kind of areas where we have a reality and we have where the steps where we want to go, and in the middle, like, the community is trying to come up with all the solutions and to cope with these problems and find the recipe to do these kind of things in healthcare. So what I'm describing here in this figure is sort of a general sort of response to a disease where as soon as you start to study something, you have so many areas of interest that are studying the same problems from different angles. And every aspect of this is generating a massive amount of data that are hard to store, hard to manage, and hard to integrate. And we travel through this journey trying to end it with really high quality data that is used as an asset to create this analytics, report, publications, and so on, and to try to make a difference and try to get sense of all this massive amount of data generated from all these different areas. So what you see here is just a really high level description, but it can be, even if you focus on one area like the clinical side and the hospitals and the data management, there's a tremendous amount of data that is there and is very hard to integrate, and people are doing as much as they can to adopt the technology and cope with all the technological, not only technological problems, but also the governance and the change management and all that comes with. So there's a very nice study in Harvard Business Review that sort of confirms what we're talking about here. And what we really need to understand is when we want to try to do the change in the healthcare or any other domain, as a matter of fact, we have to have a couple of ingredients that are present besides the data. So we need to have a commitment from leadership and the politics and to support such initiatives to try to make the change happen, leverage the data as an asset within the organization, within this the own business model of the organization, just to try to unleash the sort of information, try to transform it into the knowledge that we want. So then the other thing that is really important to know is we have to identify the bottlenecks. And this study was done over, I think, 700 organizations, and most of them, they are confirming where the problems are coming from, besides the funding. So there's the silos, there's the data fragmented, there's the quality, there is the regulatory compliance that healthcare organizations, they are coping with from data privacy perspective. And we need to be compliant, and we need to be following the standards that the community is putting in place, and that brings more complexity on the data management and utilization as an asset. And the last thing that is very important is the collaboration. This is an effort from the entire community to come up with these solutions. This is not something that's going to happen in a day. Well, obviously, we can focus on an area of an expertise, and we can make a difference. But all of us together, we can make that change happen. So looking at these problems and solutions from a distant angle, we need to make a distinction between what we see as symptoms and what are the real causes happening behind the scene that are really the root cause of all these problems from data management perspective. And again, so all the things that we are talking about here are very, very common in multiple industries, and they are really more problematic in healthcare because we have such a complex field that have so many specialties and disciplines and data variety that makes things even harder to find solution for. So with all this and through my experience, I think when we deal with sort of change, trying to use the data as an asset, there is a sort of a blueprint that is common to be used as a multi-stage sort of solution to find effective and cost-effective solutions for such problems. And this is what I call a phased approach that is incrementally disruptive, but non-invasive at the same time, which is very important. And this is where we secure the support of the community to make these change happen. So this multi-phased approach usually happen on 5 phases, from data governance, where we need to really pay attention for all the policies and rules and the regulations out there just to be compliant with the general or the regulation for that are ruling the healthcare sector in internationally, because now we are working with so many collaborations that has there's no boundary anymore, but research teams, they are international then, and we need to be compliant with so many regulations at the same time. And the other more challenging part, which is the data integration, and Carlo touched a little bit on this as well. The integration is a very, very important and hard things to do because the technology is moving very fast and the field is moving very fast as well. So we need this hybrid sort of expertise between IT people, data professionals, and healthcare professionals that are data savvy and also very aware of what's going on in the field, so that we adopt the right technology at the right time for the right problem. Now, integration is not only the key message here. This is, you can think about it like the way of putting order in the data that we have within the organization. But the most important thing is try to transform it and try to get insights out of it. And this is where we need from data tracking and analysis perspective, because we need to trace everything. We need to have sort of data lineage and data provenance tracked for every single piece of information that is being ingested within an organization. The most important stage where organizations try to move that needle that I showed earlier on in my presentation in the data maturity model is where you find the information as fast as possible. So this is a common problem in most of our organizations, and healthcare in particular, where we need to come up with ideas and solutions, try to make the data available, findable, and accessible by all stakeholders within the organization. And this is the field where people invest in data cataloging and streamlining technologies. AI, machine learning, and all the new technologies that are for under the data science area is actually exist everywhere within these phases, but especially at the end, there is that capability of using AI not just for analysis, but also for creating that angle where we put ourselves in a way we can predict what's going on with our data set. Either it's from an operational perspective or also from a research perspective, and this is where I think we get the most out of that entire pipeline when we focus on all these areas. I think that's a pretty common blueprint in healthcare to make things happen. So I just wanted to close this slides with some contact information if you want to get in touch, and you are more than welcome to visit our website, telethonkids.org.au, to learn more about Telethon Kids. And also I invite everyone to look at the accelerator page at telethonkids.org.au, where we focus on all these problems, and we try to create that precision health accelerator for research projects using and leveraging big data. Thank you, everybody.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rad. I think, you know, often we can kind of get a little bit lost in all the opportunities that data analytics and data science presents in the healthcare sector without thinking about, you know, what kind of needs to go before it, and, you know, in particular the sort of the data governance and the data integrity, etc. Which will, if we get that right, then all those benefits around the data analytics will follow. So now I will just quickly introduce our next speaker, if I may. So I'm just going to grab the screen there. So our next, sorry, Vicky. Our next speaker is,
my apologies.
No, all good. The next speaker is Vicky Falconer, and Vicky is the Big Data and Analytics Business Development Lead at AWS. For Australia and New Zealand. So she's got an amazing breadth and depth of understanding of what's happening within the data analytics, machine learning and AI space across Australia and New Zealand. And so she's going to talk to us more broadly around what are the current trends that AWS and she is seeing within data science. So Vicky, I'll let you grab the screen now.
Yeah, let me double check. Can you see that? Or...
Yep.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So first of all, thank you for the intro and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I have to say the first two speakers were absolutely brilliant, and I think you know, a really good introduction to where I want to go in this session. So, you know, I think Carlo, that vision of where we can get to with data and analytics is awesome, and that's what we're all aspiring to. We're aspiring to change outcomes for patients at the end of the day. But the reality is most organizations are really struggling with data, and they're struggling with the governance and how to bring it together in a way that's really, really useful. We did a really interesting study recently across a couple of hundred organizations in Australia, and, you know, really similar insight to what you shared. You know, they see their data maturity. I think about 60% of them saw their data maturity as either low or the one level above low, and that's sort of really surprising when we think there is so much opportunity. And so we have customers who are just, you know, really, really excited, and they want to push to the leading edge, but they're being held up by their ability to sort of manage that data. Before I jump into this session, sort of talking a little bit about the trends that we're seeing around data scientists, I just want to make a couple of comments around datathons in general, because I had the opportunity last year to judge a datathon, which was, you know, absolutely fantastic. But what really inspired me was when a group, you know, a really diverse group of people came together, and in this case, they were looking at a single data set. They just came up with so many insights that were really, really different. And to me, that's really, really encouraging, because as we can bring different perspectives to data, we can bring really, really useful insights that can drive different outcomes. And as I sit here thinking about, you know, just the breadth of data sets that sit within the healthcare ecosystems, you know, what could we do if we could bring that talent and diversity of thinking to all of those data sets? We could drive really, really tremendous outcomes. The other comment I'll make around a datathon as well is, you know, some of the most inspirational and eye-opening insights that came out of that particular event weren't necessarily the ones that used the latest, greatest technologies. It wasn't necessarily the ones that was using, you know, neural networks. Sometimes it was just something, you know, a wonderful visualization that told a story about data that you hadn't seen particularly. And so my advice, much as I'm going to talk about what we're seeing in data science, is to put yourself in the shoes of the patient, to put yourself in the shoes of the stakeholder, and think about the problems that they're trying to solve. At the end of the day, this isn't about the technology, it's about the problems we're trying to solve. And if we can keep ourselves laser focused on solving problems and gaining insight and chipping away at the sorts of problems we're trying to solve in this sector, that's where we'll drive really, really incredible outcomes. So I would really encourage people to be patient obsessed, you know, think about what differences we're trying to actually make for patients. So when I look across the industry, we see a lot of stuff happening, and I'm going to talk to all of these and then come back to some examples. So, you know, I work for a company that does everything in cloud, and I see cloud as this incredible enabler for making tools and technologies accessible to people in a way that it wasn't before. So, you know, rather than having to have access to a supercomputer, you know, a small startup can have access to the same level of compute and GPUs to run really, really interesting models on that sort of pay-per-use basis that is really, really extraordinary. But it's not just that. It's about building tools that actually give access to the sorts of algorithms that you want to use. And I've got a couple of really good examples of what we're seeing in that space as well. So you don't necessarily have to have a PhD in data science to actually be able to leverage machine learning. I think we're going to see more of that come available and become really, really specialized around industries like healthcare. I think the next thing that we're really seeing, and this speaks to both of the previous speakers, is this idea of just making data available and making it more accessible. And how do we do that in ways that are that the data is high quality, it's well catalogued, it's easily searchable, but you can get to it and do really interesting analysis against it quickly. The other thing I'll talk a little bit about is just machine learning at the edge. This is something that's just really, really being pushed currently. So you might be using something like cloud to build a model that gives you insight. Maybe it's insight into radiology images or something like that. But what you then want to do is take that model and push it maybe into a device or a machine that sits at the edge. That's not necessarily connected to anything else. And I think we'll see a lot more of that embedded machine learning inside, whether it's devices or applications that actually sit at the edge, really, really close to where we're actually dealing with the patients. The other challenge that we've seen in the industry is this idea that I would call moving from POCs to production. And I thought it was really interesting that Liz said at the start, what we want to do in something like this Datathon is, yes, we want to get great insight, we want to build models, we want to solve challenges, but we're really looking for things that we can productionize. And productionizing can actually be really quite challenging. Like if you've developed insight or you've developed a model that changes a process, actually having to do that change management around the process can be really, really challenging. And so we're putting a lot of thinking into how do we accelerate that process? How do we make that easy? And sort of in a similar vein, there's this idea that's been talked about a lot, which we call ML ops. So it's the idea of automating as much as possible of that entire sort of machine learning. It's the building of models, the training of models, the productionizing of models, the monitoring of those models. It's keeping an eye on whether they degrade. It's being able to have reproducibility in those models. We think there's tremendous opportunity for data scientists to get value out of the data, but there's a whole bunch of stuff there that's not high value. The value is in the hypotheses. The value is actually in building out the models. What we want to do is remove as much of that heavy lifting that has to sit around the edge of as possible, so that the super smart people can focus their efforts on where the real problems lie. So a couple of examples in terms of what we're seeing, and I just wanted to bring this up. This is a COVID data lake that we built earlier this year, and the intent around this was to make publicly available data available to the widest audience possible. And so we brought in a whole bunch of public data sets. We made those, you could subscribe to those data sets, you could actually write queries against those data sets on the data lake, you could pull them into your own environment, and there's a whole lot of really interesting data sets here. There's things like Johns Hopkins data, the Allen Institute, I think there's the Cord 9 data in there, so a whole bunch of research papers. But I guess our vision for this was to build a really well-curated set of data that anyone could get to. They could maybe bring it into their own environment and join it to their own their own sets of data. If they were able to, they could potentially share that back. And we wanted to build a community and access to data for anyone worldwide to sort of get on top of this. And what's really interesting about this is you can subscribe to that data through something like a data exchange. And I think this is one of the things we're going to see going forward. How do we ensure that data sets which are we are capable of sharing can actually be shared in a manner that's really, really easy for people to get to? And again, in the context of a datathon, I would be thinking, as you think about the problems that you're trying to solve, you may have some data sets that would be beautifully combined maybe with some public data sets that are out there. I think, Carlo talked to that idea a little bit earlier. So, have a look around and see what is actually going to add value or enrich the data sets or enrich the problems that you're actually working on. So that's probably the first trend around making data accessible. The second one I would suggest is around making machine learning accessible. And I think a real trend we have seen is actually building machine learning models off existing data sets that we have and enabling people just to call those models. So rather than having to go through the process of building those models themselves, just enabling API calls to previously built models. And we've done some really interesting things around speech to text type services, such that you get rid of the, I think it was alluded to, there's a bunch of really interesting data, but it might be caught up in audio files, or it might be in text files. So how do we get that data as quickly as possible into a format such that we can really make use of it? And I've actually seen a really great example of people using this sort of service actually in a clinical setting. So rather than having to write notes, actually speaking those notes and capturing those. And what's interesting about this is, these sorts of services were available, I would say, at a more generic level. What we're seeing is now specialization of these types of services in the context of the medical field. In a similar way, we're talking about things like text extraction. And again, I've seen some really, really interesting customer projects where we've taken masses of documents and we've been able to actually digitize those assets really quickly. And to the point that Rad made earlier, there's really valuable data in that, but if it takes us months or years to get to that, we lose that really rich history that we might have on patients, or on the way we treated them, or where their outcomes were. That richness is really imperative to that personalization that the guys were talking about. And then applying things like context. So again, we have another service we call Comprehend Medical, and again, it sits across the top of that data and starts to enable you to pull out entities. And it obviously has an ontology and understanding of what's relevant actually to this field. And I think we're going to see more and more of this. So we'll see more industry-specific services come out that enable you to actually, how do I say, feed your data into a service like this, extract the entities that are most relevant to what you're trying to do, and get moving. And again, we talk a lot about the heavy lifting. Let's get on with actually building those models, the area that has the most value. So I talked a little bit about machine learning at the edge, and I thought this was a really nice example. Sometimes we use cloud to build build models, train models, but then you actually want to push the inference on those models out to the edge, so potentially into a device that might sit inside, inside a diagnostic facility as such. And so I think this is a really interesting thing that we're going to see more and more going forward. This integration of machine learning into some of the devices that actually sit out there. But one of the challenges we see around this is just the availability of high quality sort of labeled data sets. And so, we have some approaches to that whereby we use humans, we use people to actually annotate those data sets, but then we apply machine learning across the top of the way they're doing that annotation to speed that process up. The other thing that's really interesting that I'm seeing in some of these data exchanges is people are not only sharing data, they're sharing things like pre-labeled data sets for other people to use in terms of, their modeling and building out sophisticated models. The other thing as well that I've seen on those is people are actually starting to exchange or sell algorithms that they've actually built. And so we think there is a marketplace for actually algorithms out there that people will start to share or potentially monetize, depending on the industry they sit in and their intention. So I just want to finish off with one last example. I've talked a little bit about data accessibility, which I think is super, super important. We've talked a little bit about actually enabling people with all sorts of capabilities to get access to some of those machine learning models. But we absolutely recognize there are times where our data scientists, our smartest people, want to bring their own framework. They have a particular, they have a particular use case they want to use for something. And so, I think, again, the beauty of cloud is that ability to actually get access to the right amount of compute you need to build these models. And this is just a wonderful example of using a deep learning AMI and TensorFlow to actually do some learning against some computer vision algorithms for CT scans, and a really, really great outcome in that one. So I hope that's given you a little bit of insight into what we're seeing in the market. I think it's it's tremendously exciting, and yeah, we're super happy to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Vicky. That was, I found that hugely fascinating, and a couple of things that you touched on that I'm extremely passionate about is that sort of, I guess, that human-centered design, and or not making it a sort of technology kind of push, but it's very much centered around the person using it and the human, and goes to those sort of design thinking types of frameworks and principles. And the other thing I'm constantly banging on about is the deployability of solutions. So if you can't deploy it across organizations, if that's going to be a huge barrier, then where's the ROI on that? So definitely two things for the teams to keep in mind as they're progressing through their potential solutions. So I will just introduce our final speaker, Dr. Martin Ebbett, who is the Director of Physics Research in Radiation Oncology at Sir Charles Gardner Hospital. And Martin is also responsible with a number of clinical collaborators for establishing the Australian Centre for Quantitative Imaging. And Martin and his team are doing some amazing things around the applications of data science in imaging. So Martin, I will hand over to you.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Excellent.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Liz. And thank you very much for inviting me to present in this the opening of the Datathon. So the previous speakers, I guess, have talked fairly generally about data science in health and medicine, and then Vicky at the end there was touching on imaging. So I'm just going to focus on imaging as a specific application and hopefully show that it's a fairly rich field with a lot of opportunities for data scientists. So first I just want to take you all back to 1895, and this is the very first human radiological image created, which was created by Wilhelm Röntgen of his wife's hand. And at the time, this was the net sum of radiological data in the world, and a sample of one. And we might look at that image and say there's maybe about 10 features that we could extract, which are representative of compressed tissue in 2 dimensions. It's some function of the composition of that tissue. And this is fairly easy to be interpreted by a radiologist. So if we skip forward 135 years or so, then this is a sort of data set that is facing clinicians now. In fact, this is only a sample of it because each of these image sets is a 3-dimensional set and we're only showing a 2-dimensional image. So here we have combinations of CT, computer tomography data, MRI data using different MRI sequences to obtain different bits of information about this patient's brain, as well as PET, positron emission tomography imaging using different traces. So traces identify different functions in the brain, and also a dynamic PET image. So each of these could also be varying in time. So we no longer have just the one patient. We may have a few hundred if this was from a clinical trial. We may have a few 100,000 if this is being extracted from the hospital's information system. And collectively, there might be 1 billion features throughout that data set, and representing a whole range of characteristics of this patient and the composition of their brain and their tissues and what their brain is actually doing. And the concept that this could be interpreted by a radiologist, even the most clever out there, is just not conceivable. If we assume that most people can manage about 10 to 20 features simultaneously, then they're not going to be able to trawl through this data set for features that may actually vary between different image types and over time. So imaging provides a very rich amount of data that we can trawl through in order to obtain information. And this little figure just comparing imaging to other ways of getting precise information on patients, and that's by taking a biopsy of their tissue or taking a sample of their blood, so a liquid biopsy. And so we're just looking here at how specific each of those techniques is, how often they can be performed, and then how accurately they give information in the spatial domain. So a solid biopsy might be very, very specific and give us genetic information about a sample of tissue, but it can't be performed frequently, and it's only for one very small location in the patient's body. A liquid biopsy will give us, can be done fairly frequently. The specificity of the information is now a bit limited because it can come from anywhere in the body, and the spatial localization is very limited because this blood is a sample of all tissues in the body essentially. So imaging can actually bridge a lot of the gaps here and increase the scope of what we can do in characterizing an individual patient. So this is just sort of illustrating the way that imaging can be used. So we're assessing a patient using different methods. So we might use PET imaging, CT or MRI or other methods. We can combine that with genetic, metabolomic, phenomic information about that patient to create a very rich data set. So we can look at extracting features from that data. So in the radiological world, we call this feature extraction the process of radiomics extraction. And we can use those features in a machine learning model to predict outcomes for those patients, for example. Or we might also use a neural network approach to extract unsupervised features from those images. And then from that process, hopefully we'll end up with a model that can be translated to understanding future patients better. So to using their information to categorize their disease, to categorize their own tissues, or to make prognoses about how they're going to respond to a specific treatment. And we might also gain some understanding about how their tissues behave. So how the cancer behaves, for example, why it responds to a certain treatment, whereas the next patient, they may not respond. And so the imaging domain in biomedicine spans everything from pathology, so looking at imaging of cells on tissue slides under microscopes, through the preclinical world, which is where we're testing drugs and interventions on animals, and right into the clinical world where we're using these technologies directly on patients. And by extracting these features, by doing the data analytics on these images and these patients' outcomes, there's a whole raft of tools that we can extract from that process, such as diagnostics tools, so screening mechanisms, decision support. So Vicky just talked about the way we can use these models to assist clinicians in making their decisions, all the way through to classification of disease, predicting how disease might respond, and even understanding it. From a global perspective, medical imaging is a huge growth area, so currently growing at about 6% per annum, which is being driven by an increase in the prevalence of chronic disease as the population ages, but especially the uptake of medical imaging in emerging economies, which is a huge driver in the market. And the analytics that's being done on these images is actually just increasing that growth even more. So now we're not just looking at these images and making decisions, we're deriving models on them, and that's actually increasing the demand for imaging so that those models can be implemented. So this is a cyclic process, and that's increasing the growth in the medical image field. Just results from the last decade in the US market. In the medical imaging field, data analytics has led to the largest number of new companies with the largest transaction volume and value of share transactions, and those companies have had the largest average revenue. So this is actually a huge market driver. And I just want to give one example of how this process occurs and what sort of information it can yield. So I particularly work in the cancer space, and one of the huge issues in treating cancer patients is when their disease metastasizes, so spreads away from where it started. And what happens is that that disease starts to evolve, its genetic characteristics start to change, and it actually starts to become resistant to the treatments we're trying to apply to it. So on the left here is a patient who has had what's called a sodium fluoride PET scan, and just delineated in red are each of the metastases in that patient at one time point. So that patient comes back a month later and is rescanned, and as you can see, their disease has increased considerably and spread throughout their body much more extensively. So this is a patient with advanced disease who's likely to die from this particular illness. So a group that we work with in Wisconsin developed this method for registering these two image data sets based on the bony anatomy of the patients. And then that information can be used to align these individual metastases between the two images, so that we can actually see which of these are responding to treatment and which are not. And we can look at the ones that are not responding and take a solid biopsy of them and get much more specific information about those lesions to understand what is it that's driving the resistance to treatment. And from this we get a map of those lesions that are responding and those that are not. So what we really want to know is, what is it in this original image at the first time point that predicts that this is going to happen to this patient, and try to intervene before that disease spread has happened. So it's interesting that the previous couple of talks have mentioned how important infrastructure and governance around data is, and it's certainly the case in our field. The tools are out there. So Vicky just talked about AWS's tools, and so access to those algorithms and the resources to do this modelling are no longer a barrier to this work. One of the main barriers is actually having the data in the first place and having it have high quality and to be able to be used. So what we really want is to be able to adapt those tools, those algorithms, to the particular problems that we're interested in. If you're a data scientist at the moment looking for a field to go into, this is certainly a great field, and some domain knowledge is an advantage, particularly if we know what types of algorithms can be applied in imaging, but certainly not essential because we tend to work in very large multidisciplinary teams where that expertise is already present. We want creative approaches to investigating this data, although I say very highly self-critical. What I mean by that is there's a lot to lose if we get these models wrong. So these are patients' lives that depend on these models. Typically we're after high sensitivity at the expense of specificity, because we don't want those false negatives slipping through, because they're the ones that end up being lethal. And we also want a learning path. And what I've got showing in this figure is starting off with a data source, which might be from a clinical trial, which passes through analysis to development of an application, to a deployed application. And this process sort of used to work maybe a decade ago, but this is a very rapidly evolving space, and this doesn't necessarily work anymore. What we really want is a cycle where we're producing these analyses, we're externally validating to make sure that they actually apply outside the space they were developed, to obtain that application and create new data, which then feeds back to that analysis process and is used to inform the application again. So it's a new way of looking at the use of data and how it needs to evolve and learn over time and adapt to what's happening to patients and how they're responding. So as Liz mentioned, we've been creating a centre called the Australian Centre for Quantitative Imaging, based here in Perth, where we're looking at implementing these techniques in different settings. So what ACCI will do is do new independent research into these algorithms and how they're used. We will support researchers who want to incorporate imaging analytics into their work to get better use of their data and better insights into their data. It'll be a training and education hub so that clinicians can become aware of data science and AI methods and how they can be used in their clinics and how they can be applied, but also a training hub for data scientists working in this area. It'll also be a centre for examining how we can deploy these particular algorithms and methods. So how do we clinically implement them, including their costing? And then also it'll be an innovation and commercialisation hub so that companies can actually come in and be embedded in this environment and learn on the data. So if you're interested, please go to ackie.org and you can also just add a request there to provide your information and let us know you're interested. So once again, just very much thank the Data Science Hub team and AWS for inviting me and supporting this initiative, which is really fantastic, and I look forward to seeing all the results that you generate. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks so much, Martin. Fascinating, and ACWI is a fantastic initiative that I know that has been a little while in the making. So great to see that it's up and running. And I think in particular around, you know, the sort of training and education and getting people sort of interested in everything that that quantitative imaging can offer. And as someone that, you know, churned through a lot of histological data in my scientific days, if only I had AI 20 years ago, it would have made my life a lot easier. So I think there's applications more broadly than just clinical, which is great to see. I think just in the interest of time, we'll probably wrap it up there. This has been recorded and will be made available. So if you know of anyone that wasn't able to make the session today, then feel free to share the recording. We'll put that on some social media posts. If you do have any questions about the Datathon, I think a lot of the speakers have sort of touched on the need to come up with solutions from diversified thinking and different skill sets. So, you know, we're not just looking for data scientists, we're not just looking for clinicians or healthcare workers. We are looking for people that are just generally interested in solving problems in healthcare using data. So don't be afraid to get involved. It's a very safe space. You'll be fully supported throughout the process, and you may come up with an amazing solution that will greatly assist the WA healthcare sector and beyond, hopefully. So the global opportunities are also immense. So I would just like to thank each of my speakers today. I have learnt a lot. There is one quick question coming in asking what data sets will be available. So we have some of the challenge owners will be bringing their own data sets to the challenges, and we will also be using open source data sets as well for the challenges. So a combination of both depending on what the challenge is as well. Any other last quick questions, please post them now. Otherwise, I will again, so just thank all the speakers today. I think that's given people a really good sense of the opportunities in the healthcare sector, kind of what's currently happening and where the trends are, and also the challenges in terms of ensuring that we get the data right. And you know, and we've got the governance and the processes in place to ensure we have the right type of data. So fantastic, everyone. Again, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing people at the Datathon. And again, thank you to our partners, Telethon Kids Institute, AWS, and the WA Life Sciences Innovation Hub as well. So thank you, and we'll see you hopefully all in November.